Opening the center and claiming a foothold for the king's bishop offers immediate attacking potential. Challenging white's central ambition, black immediately stakes a claim for a dynamic, unbalanced struggle where imbalances will be key. Immediately contesting central pawn control and preparing for rapid piece development, this move embraces dynamism. Solidifying the center, this choice prepares for a King's Indian-style setup and claims vital central squares. Opening the center aggressively challenges black's pawn structure and aims to seize the initiative. Striking open the center, black immediately contests white's central pawn presence, aiming for a dynamic, less symmetrical structure. The knight now occupies a central outpost, dictating squares and preparing for further development in this sharp Sicilian structure. Initiating development and challenging white's central knight immediately, this solidifies black's presence. Developing a knight here prepares for castling and controls central squares, a sensible step in this Sicilian defense. Preparing for a queenside pawn expansion, this offers flexibility and discourages white's knight from venturing to b5. Bolstering the knight's central presence, this bishop's redeployment aims to solidify white's pawn chain and prepare for a harmonious development of the queenside. Opening the center and challenging the knight with a pawn thrust immediately creates a dynamic imbalance and dictates the flow of the coming middle game battles. Retreating the knight from the center to preserve its presence, while preparing for a potential pawn push on the kingside, opens up avenues for queenside play. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the pawn structure in the center and prepares for castling kingside, a prudent step in this dynamic Sicilian setup. Preparing to shore up the kingside and potentially launch a pawn storm later, white wisely prevents black's knight from hopping into g4, a common annoyance in these Sicilian structures. It's a quiet, yet strategically sound prophylactic maneuver. Preparing to challenge the center and bolster its kingside defenses, this placement aims to dissuade white's g4 ideas while activating the bishop for potential central play. Positioning the knight on g3, rather than retaining its central influence on e2, signals a subtle shift towards a kingside attack, preparing to potentially launch an offensive with the g-pawn or simply to support a future advance. This maneuver aims to reorient white's attacking potential, aiming it towards the enemy monarch. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop on g7 will fortify the king's flank and offer long-term pressure along the diagonal, creating a dynamic counterplay against white's central pawn structure. Preparing for a king's side attack, the bishop now eyes the weak dark squares around black's undeveloped monarch. Developing the knight to d7 offers a flexible repositioning, potentially aiming for f8 to bolster the king's defense, or even rerouting to c5 to challenge white's advanced pieces. It also supports the eventual push of the e-pawn, aiming to seize more central territory and free the bishop on c8. This knight maneuver subtly influences the pawn structure and prepares for future pawn breaks. Finally, the white king seeks sanctuary behind its pawn shield, a prudent decision given the burgeoning activity on the queenside and the central pawn structure now becoming more defined. Securing the king now is a sensible priority, tucking it away to safety before any potential storm brews in the center or on the queenside. Preparing to unleash pressure on the kingside by reinforcing the bishop and eyeing potential mating threats, white signals aggressive intentions. Seeking to unpin the knight and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm or a safer flight square, black repositions the monarch. Instead of directly confronting white's imposing queen and bishop battery aimed at the kingside, the humble retreat of the king on h8 offers a subtle yet significant improvement in defensive coverage. This move anticipates potential threats along the g-file and provides a crucial escape route, preventing any immediate tactical disasters. It's a quiet maneuver, prioritizing king's safety above all else, a prudent decision when facing an opponent who has clearly established attacking intentions. The position remains complex, but this king repositioning acts as a crucial stepping stone, allowing black to consolidate their defenses and reevaluate their strategic options for the middle game. The deployment of the rook to the d-file signifies white's intention to seize control of this open conduit, aiming to exert pressure on black's central pawn structure, and potentially on the knight on d7. This proactive placement anticipates future skirmishes and prepares for pawn pushes or piece infiltrations along this crucial avenue, subtly influencing the entire board's dynamic balance. Black seeks to seize initiative on the queen side, aiming to disrupt White's central pawn structure and create counterplay. Recentralizing the queen offers a subtle but crucial change of perspective. Eyeing the queenside pressure Black is building with b5 and potentially preparing a counterstrike or rerouting to a more active diagonal. The queen boldly ventures towards the kingside flank, signaling an intent to disrupt White's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially threaten the White king's sanctuary. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure prevents Black from immediately exploiting the open queenside files and simultaneously prepares for a potential pawn push, aiming to restrict Black's pieces. Black's rook now marshals itself behind the advanced queenside pawn structure, a clear signal of intent to exert pressure on the queenside files, particularly the b file, potentially creating weaknesses for White's king should the queenside play accelerate. Securing the central pawn and preparing for a potential queenside expansion by Black, the knight diligently repositions to better support the d4 square and future pawn advances while maintaining flexibility. Seeking to untangle its queenside and potentially launch a counterattack, Black's queen maneuvers to c7, aiming to link up with the rook on a8 and prepare for future pawn pushes like b4, while also keeping an eye on the central d5 square. Shifting the knight from the active kingside to the queenside, a curious maneuver aiming to bolster the queenside pawn structure and potentially reinforce the d7 knight's defense. The knight on g3 seemed poised for attack, so this redeployment signals a change of strategic priorities, perhaps anticipating a queenside expansion from Black or seeking to evade Black's bishops. It might also be a preparatory step for a queenside pawn advance of White's own, or simply a way to untangle the pieces, freeing up the g3 square for another piece. The knight's repositioning to b6 is an intriguing maneuver, aiming to shore up the queenside and potentially join an assault on White's central pawn structure, hinting at a desire to activate the queenside pieces in unison. This exchange liberates the c-file and opens avenues for White's rook, potentially creating a dynamic imbalance as Black's queenside structure becomes more rigid. Capturing the knight on b6, Black aims to disrupt White's central control and open up the b-file for potential pressure, though it does create a doubled pawn. This exchange, however, simplifies the position and might be an attempt to steer the game towards a slightly more open structure where Black's pieces can become more active, especially the queen. The rook on b6 now has a prominent central role, looking to influence the d4 square and the queenside pawn structure. The knight repositions to a more central square, ready to join the kingside attack and potentially support a future f4 push, while simultaneously creating a blockade against Black's queenside expansion. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, Black boldly pushes the b-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt White's solid structure. This advance forces White to react immediately, potentially creating imbalances and opening lines for Black's pieces. The knight's hop to a4 aims to disrupt Black's pawn chain and gain central influence, a sharp tactical pivot after the earlier pawn sacrifices. Reclaiming the rook to the open file, aiming to disrupt White's central influence and prepare for future pawn advances on the queenside. Opening the file injects immediate tension, forcing Black to confront the newly exposed central pathway and the potential for White's pieces to infiltrate. This pawn grab, while seemingly simple, fundamentally alters the board's spatial dynamics, transforming a relatively closed position into one ripe for exploitation along the now open avenue. The consequences ripple through Black's position, potentially isolating pieces or creating weaknesses around the king as the defender scrambles to reinforce. Consider the delicate balance Black must strike between defending against this new threat and continuing their own queenside expansion. Embracing the open file, Black seizes the initiative by rerouting the rook to the open b-file, creating immediate pressure and potential for further infiltration. This dynamic repositioning aims to exploit the newly created weakness in White's queenside pawn structure and challenges White's central control. Initiating the invasion, This maneuver aims to pierce black's queenside pawn shield, seeking to open lines for the rook and potentially target the vulnerable b-pawn. Black attempts to untangle their pieces and activate the queen, but this maneuver might leave their kingside slightly exposed to the potential pressure from white's rook on the file and the knight on a4. The pawn structure is becoming quite complex, and careful calculation is needed to navigate the upcoming exchanges. A tactical reorientation, shifting the knight to a more active diagonal and potentially setting up a future attack on black's queenside structure. The structural integrity of white's queenside crumbles as black's rook penetrates, immediately exploiting the open file to threaten the pinned knight and disrupt white's coordination. A fascinating repositioning, the knight gracefully retreats to d1, potentially setting up a sneaky advance on the queenside or a swift redeployment to the kingside. This subtle maneuver aims to escape black's aggressive queenside pawn push and the created complexities, seeking to rebuild white's structural integrity and survey the board with a fresh perspective. The knight's journey to d1 is not a retreat from battle, but a strategic withdrawal to reassess the battlefield and prepare for a more impactful engagement. This quiet repositioning highlights the subtle interplay of piece activity and positional advantage, demonstrating that not all impactful moves are flashy captures or direct threats. Repositioning the rook to a more active file, aiming to contest control of the b-file and potentially support advances on the queen side, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn structure after the recent exchanges. A daring thrust to seize the open file and disrupt black's queenside structure, forcing a decision about the exposed rook. Activating the bishop on d8 not only brings a dormant piece into the fray, but also prepares for a potential pawn push on the queenside, aiming to break white's control over the file and challenge the active rook. Sacrificing the rook, white initiates a bold maneuver to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially expose the black king. A bold maneuver to reclaim material, though it leaves your king's diagonal somewhat exposed to future threats from the light-squared bishop. Asserting pressure on the queenside with the knight's advance, white aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially exploit weaknesses on the c-file. This maneuver not only seeks to dislodge the b4 pawn, but also prepares for a potential kingside assault by repositioning pieces towards the center. The knight makes a dramatic diagonal leap, aiming to destabilize white's queenside and potentially disrupt the pawn structure, all while eyeing opportunities that might arise from white's somewhat awkward knight placement. The queen repositions, seeking to exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure and potentially support a central breakthrough, or create new attacking chances on the kingside where black's king currently resides. Shifting the knight to the f4 square dramatically tightens the screws on white's kingside, creating a potent attacking platform poised to exploit the weakened pawn structure around the enemy king. Unlocking the d-file pressure, this maneuver aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal and potentially support a central pawn push later on. Reinforcing the central pawn structure while simultaneously opening a vital diagonal for the bishop is the immediate objective here, a subtle but significant repositioning. This bold pawn thrust seizes immediate central space, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious piece placement and potentially pry open the c-file for white's rooks. Observe how the pawns now clash, creating unavoidable tactical skirmishes that will test black's defensive structure and coordination. It's a provocative challenge, forcing a reaction and potentially exposing weaknesses in black's queenside pawn chain if not handled precisely. Unleashing the pawn on the queenside opens critical lines for counterplay, threatening to disrupt white's queenside stability and potentially creating active piece play for black's initiative. Seizing the open g-file is a clever attempt to disrupt black's centralized pieces, particularly aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses around the king once that diagonal opens up. Redeploying the knight to the queenside, a curious repositioning that sacrifices tempo for a potential reroute via g7 or f6, hinting at a desire to reinforce the kingside or perhaps explore tactical possibilities around white's vulnerable queen placement. But it leaves the d-pawn potentially exposed and concedes significant space to white's advancing pawns. Opening the e-file offers a direct assault on black's previously fortified position, creating immediate pressure on the king's defenses and exploiting the now exposed diagonals. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, black opens critical lines towards white's monarch, creating a dynamic imbalance and forcing white to react defensively. This bold aggression dramatically shifts the battle's focus. Unleashing a devastating attack, the queen boldly ventures into enemy territory, aiming to shatter the defensive structure surrounding the black king by threatening a swift mate. The knight's retreat to g7 strategically bolsters the kingside defense, creating a crucial pawn chain and preparing to contest the open g-file should white attempt to exploit it. This maneuver simultaneously allows for potential counterplay on the queen side, offering flexibility in navigating the increasingly complex board. Rerouting the queen to a more active square, this repositions the monarch's guardian from the passive d2 post, eyeing the now undefended pawns on the queen side and potentially supporting a pawn pushed down the a-file, while keeping an eye on the g7 knight's precarious position. Unleashing a pawn storm, this aggressive thrust aims to shatter white's central structure and pry open lines towards the king, creating chaos and potentially exposing weaknesses that were previously well defended. Exposing the king to this degree after such pawn sacrifices on the queen side is a stark positional gamble, a desperate attempt to generate counterplay while neglecting king's safety, which now seems to be the primary concern. Unleashing the knight to f5 injects dynamic attacking potential, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn shield and exploit the now exposed king. Securing the bishop's retreat and preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm, this maneuver subtly repositions a key piece, aiming to bolster the center and enhance defensive capabilities. Shifting the queen to d7 seeks to activate the piece, eyeing the potentially weak squares on the king side, and perhaps preparing for a pawn advance on the f-file or a regrouping maneuver to challenge the control of the central files. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, white aims to pry open lines for attack, but risks weakening their own monarch's sanctuary in the process. Black's sudden capture of the pawn on c4 ignites a tactical wildfire, disrupting white's centralized control and creating immediate threats against the weakened kingside. Sacrificing the rook opens a vital diagonal for the queen to pry open the kingside and exploit the exposed pawn structure. Unleashing the knight's potential, nd4 intercepts critical central squares and opens up attacking avenues toward white's unsettled king, forcing a reconsideration of the pawn structure and piece placement that followed the rook exchange. Rallying the bishop to the d4 square offers a potential escape for the king and a defense against the immediate threats, while also preparing to contest the open files. Sacrificing the bishop here opens a perilous diagonal towards your king, creating a serious vulnerability that white's queen and knight can exploit. Exploiting the pinned knight, this rook capture opens up a tactical battlefield, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking chances against the exposed king. Hoping to snag a pawn and disrupt white's central structure, black offers a daring exchange, but might find their pieces awkwardly placed for defense if white can regroup effectively. Asserting control over the d-file with this rook transfer immediately probes black's defenses, aiming to exploit the open lines created by the recent pawn exchanges and the vulnerable state of the black king. The knight, having retreated to a safer square, now aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially fork the king and rook if white isn't careful. Unleashing the rook to h5 finally disrupts the queenside's composure, aiming to exploit the g7 pawn's exposed position and the king's lingering discomfort. A desperate attempt to ignite a flicker of counterplay amidst a collapsing position, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's regal sanctuary and perhaps even lure some pieces out of their defensive posts, but it likely opens too many dangerous lines for the enemy to exploit. Unleashing the bishop allows for a desperate attempt to activate the dormant pieces and create complications, but it leaves the king exposed to potential mating threats down the g-file. Unleashing a desperate counterattack, black sacrifices the bishop to create a protected passed pawn and disrupt white's attacking structure. Unlocking the c-file for the rook is the primary objective here, aiming to create immediate threats against black's somewhat exposed king. This decision pivots the game towards a more dynamic phase, capitalizing on the open lines that have emerged from the recent pawn exchanges. The knight's repositioning subtly reinforces the central pawn structure while also preparing to potentially support an attack on the king side or contest the newly opened avenues. It's a move that looks beyond the immediate material balance and focuses on harnessing the dynamic potential of the position. Sacrificing the bishop to achieve complete control of the vital central dark squares and reroute the queen to a more active position. The desperate attempt to create a pawn storm suddenly appears quite toothless as white aims to activate the forgotten h-pawn, perhaps hoping for a miraculous defensive setup or to distract from the precarious king situation. Seizing the initiative with the queen, black aims to disrupt white's recent pawn advances and create counterplay, potentially eyeing the vulnerable king side. Reclaiming the initiative and redeploying the bishop to a more active square aims to disrupt black's menacing passed pawn and re-establish some defensive coverage around the white king. The bishop's aggressive foray to the front line injects immediate tactical complications, forcing white's king into a potentially precarious position as the pawn chain crumbles around it. Seizing the initiative with a decisive rook sacrifice, white gambles on disrupting black's highly centralized pieces and opening new lines of attack towards the exposed king. The pawn recaptures, bringing a crucial piece back into the fray and potentially reigniting the attack, but it also opens a path for white's remaining pieces to target black's exposed monarch. Unleashing a devastating attack on the exposed black king, the queen now eyes a potent battery along the open diagonal. Chasing the queen to the edge of the board can sometimes backfire, and here black might be hoping to untangle their pieces, but they are still in a precarious position with their king exposed and white's pieces poised to exploit the open lines. The queen trades off, simplifying into an endgame where white's king is far safer and black's passed pawn on the h-file, while dangerous, requires careful handling. The rook captures the pawn, creating an endgame where the remaining pieces will fight for dominance on the open board. The bishop's final maneuver seeks to activate a dormant piece, though it leaves the king side potentially exposed to discovered attacks if black can exploit the open diagonals. A strategic reassessment is underway as black solidifies the pawn chain, aiming to create a more robust defensive structure against white's probing bishop. Pushing the king forward into the fray, an audacious bid to activate it for the endgame, though it certainly exposes the monarch to potential immediate counterplay from black's bishop and knight. Consolidating the king's safety becomes paramount as the material on the board thins, creating a crucial defensive fortification. Unleashing a potent fork, this check aggressively targets black's king and knight, forcing an immediate decision that will drastically alter the board's complexion. Finally, black's monarch seeks refuge from the relentless pressure on the king side, attempting to regroup and consolidate forces amidst the chaos. A decisive fork, exploiting the pinned knight's immobility and exposing the black king to immediate mating threats. The king's precarious position is highlighted as black seeks to extricate their monarch from the immediate danger zone, initiating a strategic retreat toward potentially safer squares. Reclaiming the outpost on f5, white aggressively reclaims central influence, aiming to disrupt black's already shaky coordination. This strategic repositioning promises a more dynamic battle, potentially exploiting any lingering weaknesses in black's pawn structure and bishop placement. A bold decision to activate the rook, eyeing potential infiltration through the central files, though it does leave the pawn structure slightly more vulnerable on the queen side. Pushing the h-pawn forward gains vital breathing room for the white king, preparing for a potential escape route should the black queen or rook manage to penetrate further into white's defensive structure. Seizing the open file now provides the black rook a potential avenue to penetrate white's defenses and disrupt the harmonious placement of white's pieces, particularly the king, which has been quite exposed. This king walk is a daring attempt to activate the monarch, though it leaves it exposed to potential checks and complicates piece coordination in what's becoming a tense endgame. Unleashing the bishop from its recent confinement, this maneuver seeks to activate the piece towards the king side, potentially bolstering the attack or at least finding a more influential square than its previous passive placement. Reclaiming the initiative on the king side by repositioning the knight allows white to potentially support a future pawn push or prepare for a tactical exchange that simplifies into a more favorable endgame. Unleashing the rook to the second rank injects a new dimension of pressure, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position and potentially fork the light-squared bishop and knight. The white king bravely ventures forward, seeking to join the skirmish on the king side, hoping to support its advanced pawns and potentially create new threats in this complex endgame where piece activity often trumps material advantage. Reactivating the bishop to the center allows it to join the struggle for control of key squares and potentially support a pawn push later on. Solidifying the bishop's position and preparing for a potential pawn advance on the king side. Unleashing the rook to its final file, seeking to pry open critical diagonals and exploit the exposed king. Activating the knight to a more dynamic central square offers increased attacking potential against black's exposed king and helps contain any breakthrough attempts from black's queen. Activating the rook and preparing to join the fray on the king side, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and exploit the open g-file. A strategic pivot towards dominating the central files, now that the queens are off the board and the pawn structure is somewhat fluid. This redirection of the knight aims to exploit the open d-file and potentially create threats against black's weakened king's side. Consider how the knight's new placement at d6, supported by the pawn at c4, exerts pressure on key squares like e8 and f7. The move also prepares for future maneuvers, perhaps a push of the g-pawn or a repositioning of the bishop to a more active diagonal, all while keeping the king relatively safe. It's a subtle but potent reinforcement of white's initiative, subtly tightening the noose on black's position. A courageous redeployment of the bishop, venturing deep into enemy territory to contest the crucial light squares and create potential counterplay, albeit at the risk of isolation. Aimed at clearing a path for the rook to potentially join the attack on the king side, the bishop shifts, setting up a future exchange that might disrupt black's pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop onto the long diagonal after a period of cautious maneuvering, black aims to activate a sidelined piece and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. The knight scurries forward, aiming to infiltrate black's weakened king's defenses and exploit the open diagonals. The king embarks on a daring expedition across the board, seeking active participation in the ensuing exchanges, a bold strategy given the surrounding enemy pieces. The knight bravely ventures back towards its starting square, aiming to solidify the pawn structure on the king side and prepare for a potential advance of the central pawns, seeking to exploit the weakened position of black's monarch. The bishop's retreat to c6 finally offers a bit of breathing room, no longer directly attacked and potentially setting up a future outpost on d5, though the knight on e3 still poses a threat. Repositioning the bishop to the king's pawn side offers crucial defensive support for the pawn structure and prepares to contest the open files should black decide to advance. The knight, finding itself cornered and unable to influence the crucial central squares, redirects its energy towards the queen side, aiming to participate in the struggle for pawn advances and potentially threaten white's king should it become exposed. Finally, the bishop's path to freedom is opened, aiming to disrupt the opposing king's precarious shelter. Unleashing the passed pawn offers a glimmer of hope, injecting some much-needed dynamism into black's previously stagnant position. Initiating a knight repositioning to potentially bolster the kingside defense and create new attacking avenues. The black bishop on d7, now seemingly out of play, prepares to shift its influence, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side. Seizing a pawn in this endgame situation opens up black's king, potentially creating mating nets or strong attacking chances for white's remaining pieces, especially with the active knight. Exposing the monarch to this degree is highly perilous, as white's pieces are now poised to exploit the open avenues with devastating effect. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, white attempts to pry open the dark squares around black's king, seeking to exploit the exposed position after the recent exchanges. The king, now fully exposed on the kingside, faces immediate and overwhelming threats as it ventures out to capture the pawn. Seizing the open file is paramount now, creating a direct threat to the king.